Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Chloe Luke from the Department of EIE. It is my great honor to be the MC today. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the Knowledge and Exploration Talk Series organized by the Student Affairs Office. These talk series aim to broaden students' horizon beyond the selected academic field. We will invite guest speakers from different areas to share their expertise areas that you want to know more about but may not have chance to learn in your studying program. For example, students majoring in sciences may want to explore more about culture, design, or history, while students studying arts may want to know more about artificial intelligence, robots, or other technological and scientific concepts and developments. These talks are going to be held in the forthcoming semesters, with focus on specific areas and its applications. To kick off the talk, namely the silver lining of COVID-19, we are very pleased to have Professor Esmond Mock, the Dean of Students and the Director of Student Affairs, to deliver the welcome address. Professor Mock, please.
Good afternoon, students, teachers, and colleagues. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this Dean of Students talk. Let me just use these opportunities to introduce Mr. Leung. Mr. Leung is the former Assistant Director of the Hong Kong Observatory. As many of you may know, he is the host of the popular science TV program, Mo Observatory. In Cantonese, it's called Mo Chak Tin. Besides, he is the spokesperson of 350 Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Meteorological Society. Moreover, Mr. Leung is actively involved in environmental issues in Hong Kong and is the advisor of the Council for Sustainable Development, helping in formulating Hong Kong's long-term decarbonization strategy. The topic of his talk today is the silver lining of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic is causing a global health crisis, has affected our daily life and the environment. Can this adverse situation provide us with opportunities in tackling environmental concerns? I'm sure Mr. Leung will give us valuable insights on this question. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Leung Wing Mo. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mock, for the kind introduction. It is indeed my great pleasure to be able to talk to all of you. I've been associated with PolyU for quite a long time, actually. This is the 7th year, actually. I work in the LSGI department. In case you're not familiar, is the Land Surveying and Geoinformatics department. But I teach things which is basically related to climate change. So let me have the first slides, please. Okay, COVID-19, the silver lining. I'm going to digress a little bit. Instead of talking about the theme that I'm going to share with you, COVID-19, the silver lining, and its connection with climate change and so on, I want to talk about the photo that I've chosen. I chose this photo for obvious reason, because you can notice the edge of the cloud being lit up by the sunlight, all right? So this is what we call the silver lining. But I think when you first see this photo, what catch your attention is probably not the cloud and the silver lining, but instead the sunlight, right? The sunlight seems to be diverging from a point behind the cloud, and obviously that point is the sun. So, but you probably immediately ask the question, didn't my physics or science teacher tell me that sun's rays should be parallel because of the immense distance between the sun and the earth? To be more exact, is 150 million kilometers away from the earth. So in all practical sense, the sun's rays should be parallel. But of course, the explanation to this visual phenomenon is of course the problem of perspective. Just like when you are standing on a very straight and narrow and long road, where you stand, the road is very wide, but if you look ahead of you, the longer the distance away from you, the narrower it gets. So this is just a problem of perspective. So I think this picture tells us something, which is what we see is not necessarily the truth, right? So probably this is one moral from this picture. And to know the truth, we have to be critical, we have to be skeptical, we have to increase our level of understanding. And this is exactly the reason why the Dean of Students talk, the purpose of Dean of Students talk. And then the other thing that I come to my mind about this picture is, of course, a silver lining. To most of us, the cloud seems to be lit up by the sunlight and shining through the clouds, right? But as a matter of fact, if we go to a little bit more into the physics, it's actually not the sunlight shining through the clouds. It's actually, the sunlight is actually like water flowing around the obstacles, bending as it moves around the cloud. This is a property called diffraction. In Chinese, it's 游射, 即係繞嗰啲物體. So it's a phenomenon of diffraction. It's not shining through the cloud. The fact that sunlight can diffract, or the fact that there is diffraction, is because of the wave property of sunlight. And that is actually a phenomenon that was hypothesized more than 300 years ago by a Dutch scientist called Huygens in the 17th century. But more or less at the same time, the great physicist Isaac Newton proposed a completely different hypothesis, that sunlight is consisting of photons, or corpuscular theories, right? Little particles of energy are carried by the sunlight. So these two theories seem to contradict one another. But the latest understanding of the nature of sunlight is that it possesses both property. So it can be wave, it can be particle-like, what we call photons. And this gives us another moral of this picture, which is that the world that we are living in is not necessarily either white or black. It could be sometimes white, sometimes black, and sometimes gray. All right, the last sort of moral that we can get from this picture is the focus of what we're going to talk about today. To every cloud, there is a silver lining. Now, but when we say that, the silver lining is something good, meaning that we can derive something good out of something not very pleasant. But the fact that we say that to every cloud there is a silver lining, it seems to imply the connotation that the cloud is associated with bad weather, right? Just like today, when you go outside, you see the sunshine, you see blue sky, and we sort of describe it as very fine weather, beautiful fine weather. But when the sky is filled with clouds, and for that matter, maybe thunderstorm clouds, maybe typhoons, we used to describe them as bad weather. So clouds have the connotation of something bad. But if we look at it in a different perspective, imagine you're people living in a parched piece of land, like Australia, Queensland, that I visited some 6 or 7 years ago, amid an 18-month drought. Then you will welcome the appearance of cloud and thunderstorm, even typhoons, because it brings rain to you, right? So this sort of give us, it hinted us to reflect that we are perhaps a little bit too egocentric. We are a little bit too self-centered, right? This phenomenon of thunderstorms and clouds or typhoons or whatever it is just a natural phenomena. It should not be described as a natural disaster as such. So it's only when we put ourselves in harm's way that a natural phenomenon becomes a natural disaster. So I think this is a time, the COVID-19 is a time for us to reflect whether we should consider ourselves to be the center of the earth or the center of the universe. All right, so much for the digression. So let's move on. So this is the brief outline, all right? I'll talk about some impacts of COVID-19. Obviously, not about the health impact because, first of all, I'm not a COVID-19 expert. I am just a weatherman. I'm interested in weather and climate. So I'm going to talk about some alternative impacts, how it impacted weather, how it impacted the environment. And then I'll try to find some connection between COVID-19 and climate change. And lastly, what lessons we can learn from this sort of pandemic that we're facing now. All right, impact. This is back home in Hong Kong. Hong Kongers flock to Country Park. This is a very good thing. We come to appreciate the nature. And as a matter of fact, we have something like 60% of the Hong Kong area covered by Country Park. So this is a treasure that we all appreciate. But this is something that we do not really desire. It's good to reinvigorate our life by going to the Country Park more often. But this is a site that to me is tragic. That to me is that we are not learning from the crisis we are facing now. One of the reasons why we are faced with this pandemic of COVID-19 or other similar infectious disease is our disrespect of the environment. So while we are enjoying the countryside, if you really love the countryside and love nature, there is really no reason why we should jeopardize its long-term future. So perhaps we should reflect on ourselves as to whether we should be more considerate about nature and the environment. And as I mentioned earlier, we should not be too much self-centered and egocentric. This is quite the opposite. We flocked to the countryside here in Hong Kong, but to the left, this is Wales. So the mountain goats are taking back the cities of the Wales. And to the right are the wild geese of India. So it seems that animals, wild animals, and we Hong Kongers are doing the exact opposite. We conquer the countryside, whereas the wild animals are sort of taking back the cities. Now, my first impression of these two pictures and other similar pictures is that this is a very lovely scenes. If you imagine one day that we go outside from our home, from our office, then we are greeted by someone we know, our neighbors and so on, but also at the same time, greeted by wild animals like this. Maybe, I don't know, maybe a bird or maybe other wild animals. Then what a nice world it will be, right? So I think these wild animals are actually messengers of hope and possibilities. They give us, they daring us to think of a better future after this nightmare called the COVID-19 is gone. And we are confident that one day, sooner or later, that COVID-19 will be gone, will be behind us. So these are messengers of hope and possibilities. But if we think a little bit further, and we ask ourselves the question, why we didn't see this kind of pictures before? Well, of course, the obvious reason is that these wild animals are afraid of us human beings. And that takes us to another problem, which is that we human beings, being too ecocentric, being too self-centered, are actually, having been a long time, be antagonistic with Mother Nature and other wild animals. If we look back at the history of our human civilization, About 100,000 years ago, our ancestors, the first Homo sapiens, migrated from Africa to the Middle East and then to Europe and all over the world. And then with this mass migration, started waves after waves of disappearance of species all over the world. And the latest example is the colonization of Madagascar, just about 2,000 years ago, not too long ago. And when we began to colonize Madagascar, animals like elephant birds, like the hippos, like the lemurs were completely gone from this vast island of Madagascar. So this is exactly the situation which is warned by the scientists, that thousands of species became extinct every year, now as we speak. And therefore, we are facing the danger of another mass extinction. And scientists warn that this mass extinction has already occurred. Well, we know in history that there were 5 mass extinctions, meaning that something like 60 to 95% of all the species of the world were gone, were wiped out from the surface of the earth. But the distinction between this current mass extinction and the previous 5 mass extinction is that the culprit for the occurrence of mass extinction is because of one single species, that is we human beings. The previous 5 mass extinctions are because of natural reasons, maybe a gigantic meteor striking the earth some 65 million years ago, where all the dinosaurs are gone. And then because of global warming, as a result of violent explosion of volcanoes, filling up the atmosphere with lots of carbon dioxide and so on. So this mass extinction that is starting right now is because of the existence of human beings. So this picture, despite being a very funny, lovely, pleasant one, offers us some reflection, opportunity of reflection as to our role in this earth. So other impacts of this COVID-19 is reflected by this graph here. This is a little bit complicated. The light colors represent the period, well, you should see the timing. This is a timeline. So this is December last year and so forth and so on up to May this year. So the lighter color represent more seismic noise, so to speak, because of all those human activities like MTRs, like trucks, like planes, whatever and so on. The activities are transmitted to the crust of the earth and become seismic signals. So this part, which is to the left side of this white line, white dotted line, are those periods where we have stronger seismic signals. And this darker color side are those periods where the seismic signals becomes much lighter. So this is a reflection of the effects of lockdown of our cities, that even down beneath the crust of the earth, we hear less noise as a result of less human activity. So I call this the silent spring, because for most cities, this occurs earlier in the eastern part, for example, Taipei, Hong Kong, Beijing. The separation between the noisy period and the less noisy period started much earlier. But for the Western world is a couple of months later and so on. So this is, we are living in a sort of period where it seems to be a little bit quieter than before. We have cleaner air, and that is something that we noticed from the news. Thanks to the satellite operated by the European community, the Copernicus, I think a lot of my colleagues in RSGI knows much better than I do. This is what we call remote sensing. So we don't need to install any instrument at the ground level to find out the air pollution at those parts of the earth. So here we are. This is China around January in the first part of January, the colors represent high concentration of nitrogen dioxide. And this same map here is for February, where a lot of cities were locked down. So this pollution of nitrogen dioxide will more or less completely gone. And this is the specific concentration in Wuhan. So the nitrogen dioxide level before the lockdown was to be taken as a reference at 0. And then we see drastic drop in the nitrogen dioxide after the city lockdown. And that occurs in other parts of the world as well. For example, in Italy, we have high concentration of nitrogen dioxide, again, thanks to the Copernicus satellite. And then after the city lockdown, we have much reduced carbon dioxide. So it seems to us from the pictures, from the visual impression, and also from hard scientific data, that Mother Nature is rejuvenating, right? It seems that there is a sort of resurrection of the Mother Nature. But unfortunately, I think this is short-lived or ephemeral. Well, another demonstration of better air is, of course, in this picture, which is taken from Punjab, which is a northern state of India. People who have been living in Punjab for decades have never been able to see the Himalayas as a background, simply because of the very poor air quality. As a matter of fact, because India is one of the countries which extensively use coal for generation of electricity, and also burning the biomass. Biomass, not the kind of high-tech biomass fuels that we used, but also but the low-grade biomass like the dung of the cattle and so on. So this part of the world, the Southern Asia, is the part of the world where we have one of the worst air quality all over the world. But because of this COVID-19, because of the cessation of active human activities, for the first time in many decades, the people in Punjab can see the Himalayas as a background. As a matter of fact, I was in Nepal doing some hiking quite some time ago, and the Himalayas from Nepal is always shrouded with some sort of haze and clouds and so on. You never see Himalayas very clearly from a distance. Now, because of COVID-19, the sky becomes much clearer. So all this improvement in the environmental conditions, in the air quality and so on. But as I said, this is only ephemeral. And it doesn't apply to all pollutants in the air. One of the pollutants is carbon dioxide concentration. And this is a carbon dioxide concentration from 2016, so just 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. Each of this dot here represent a monthly average, right? So we see a periodic variation of carbon dioxide due to the fact that plants can absorb and sometimes release carbon dioxide. During summertime, plants in Northern Hemisphere absorb a lot of carbon dioxide, so therefore we see the dip in the carbon dioxide. And during wintertime, carbon dioxide rose again and so forth and so on. So this is a sort of periodic change. And this line is a yearly average. So we see a monotonous rise in the carbon dioxide level. If we compare the concentration of carbon dioxide in August last year, 407, with that of August this year, 409, we see approximately 2 ppm, part per million increase in carbon dioxide. This is slightly less than the average of 2.3 ppm for the past 10 years. So as far as carbon dioxide concentration is concerned, we are still seeing some rise, although about 10% less than before. So the air is still polluted with greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide. I don't know whether you noticed lately whether or not that the forecast of the Hong Kong Observatory is a little bit worse off. I'm not sure, because this is just, gut feeling, right? Probably one of the the deeper impression you get is the number 8 signal a couple of months ago. And a lot of people complained that, oh, there was really no wind, and the winds were not really strong. But as a matter of fact, COVID-19 has some effect to the weather forecast. Reason being that this is a picture showing some of the weather information we get from Dragon Air. Unfortunately, Dragon Air is no longer with us, Guanglong. This is what we call AMDAR, A-M-D-A-R, which are the airplane meteorological information transmitted in real time to the Hong Kong Observatory. So we have lots of information from different airplanes, but because of COVID-19, the amount of volume of information dropped drastically. So this is due to the airplane alone. All right, one source of information, weather information, is drastically reduced. And this map here shows the meteorological information on the surface. Those regions with darker colors, for example, South America, Africa, and so on, are in a situation where they have reduced surface observations. But to do a good forecast, we need good data. We need good observation data. So with the decrease of observation data, on the right panels, we see some impact on the forecast. This map represents the change of temperature forecast, or error actually. If we have positive error, which is red in color, it means that we're doing badly. If we're blue colors, it means that we're improving, okay, compared with about a couple of years ago. So we see, as far as temperature is concerned, it's purely red, a little bit of blue over there. For RH, relative humidity, basically red. And then for surface pressure and also for wind speed, we see deterioration of the quality of weather forecast. Luckily, the deterioration occurs at very high latitudes, mostly at very high latitudes. So we are not, well, badly impacted as far as the weather forecast in our region is concerned. So nevertheless, this is some kind of impacts brought about by COVID-19. Now, going back to this connection between climate change and COVID-19, we all know too well that COVID-19 started with the coronavirus, possibly transmitted through bat, and then to the pangolin, and then eventually perhaps eaten by some Chinese in Wuhan and from the wet market and so on. Some of them get infected, and that starts the whole COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a biological phenomenon. How about climate change? Well, I think most of you know about that. We have the atmosphere. The atmosphere is basically transparent to the sunlight. So the energy of the sunlight is not actually absorbed by the atmosphere. So the sunlight doesn't heat up the air. But when the sunlight reaches the surface of the earth, be it the ocean or be it the land masses and so on, it is taken up by those materials, the trees, the sand, the soil, and so on. And the earth warms up. It started to emit infrared radiation, and those are caught up by the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, ozone, and others. And as a result, the earth started to warm up. So we have a warming earth. So this is obviously an exaggeration, just to attract more attention. So we have a warmer world, and this rising in temperature will sort of twist the pattern of weather. This is actually a radar picture. But I applied some kind of software that the radar picture, the normal radar picture, is distorted into something like a whirlpool. So this is to show us that some physical change, which is basically the change in temperature, give rise to a series of chain reaction. And the end result is that we're going to see more extreme weather. So one is biological world and the other is physical world. Are they connected? Yes, of course. If you study the climate system of the Earth, it is not just consisted of the atmosphere alone, although the atmosphere is the one which is we're concerned about most because it's in direct contact with us. But there are other components of the climate system, and the biosphere is one of them. So this very busy slide shows us some connection between the change in the physical world, which in this case is climate change, to other factors, other sectors of the Earth, in particular, how it affects our health. So for example, under the context of climate change, we see some heavier rainfall in some parts of the world, coupled with the rising temperature. We see more breeding grounds for the mosquitoes. And the mosquitoes, of course, will give us dengue fevers, malaria, and as a result, the problem of mosquito or vector-borne diseases are on the rise, right? The other impact of climate change is, of course, that because a lot of animals do not like the warming world, so they move around, right, in search for some places which is more suitable for them. So because of that movement, it increases the contact between different wild animals. Therefore, the transmission of zoonosis disease or diseases associated with wild animals increases. Because in the old days, maybe one animals live in one part of the world and the other kind of species live in other part of the world. There is no contact. But under the context of climate change, the contact become more closer, and there is a higher probability of them transmitting diseases to one another and eventually to us as a human species. Now, climate change also affects this part, which is called biodiversity. As I mentioned earlier on, we are already at the beginning of the 6th mass extinction. Species are getting less and less. Thousands of species are gone every year. Now, there is a phenomenon called dilution effect as far as disease transmission is concerned. In particular, zoonosis diseases, which is again the infectious disease associated with wild animals. Now, that dilution effect means that if we have more species, if we have more wild animals, then the virus will be concentrated in those species without spreading around. So the chances of we human beings get infected by those diseases, infectious diseases, will be less than it is now because of the infringement of the biodiversity. And also because of climate change, and also because of our action of cutting down the forest, the habitat of the wild animals are gone or are degraded. And as a result, they move around and it enhances of course, the transmission of the virus. And one last thing, which is indicated in this slide here, is that climate change impact upon our environment to the extent that it will also impact the agricultural productivity. And some part of the world would suffer from extreme weather, will get loss in farm yield. As a result, a lot of children are stunting, so to speak, meaning that they do not develop well, meaning that their immunity system is not as good as a healthy child. And as a result, they are more vulnerable to the attack of the zoonovirus diseases, and COVID-19 is just but one example. But of course, there are silver linings. We should, as an intelligent species, we should learn from this sad story of COVID-19. So what are the lessons learned? This effect, or this crisis, I should say, the first one, the top one, is about climate change, and the bottom one is about COVID-19. They are not black swan. This one, black swan is kind of rarity. It conveys the connotation that it is associated with a rare event, which is unpredictable, but it carries a high impact. Obviously, climate change and COVID-19 carries high impact, but they are not black swan because scientists have been warning about these two crises for a long, long time. Take, for instance, Bill Gates. Bill Gates made a talk, delivered a talk 5 years ago, and he said that the thing that worries him most is not nuclear war, because when he was a child, Bill Gates is about the same age as I do. So when he was a child, he was brought up in the Cold War between the East and the West. In that case, it's basically the US and the Soviet Union at that time. So the fear of a nuclear war was very real at that time. But Bill Gates said that now he was not worried about nuclear war, but instead he worried about coronavirus and a pandemic. And that is his talk in 5 years ago. Of course, Bill Gates was no epidemiologist, 唔係一個流行學家. But of course, he's very learned. He learned a lot from other scientists and so on. That's why he came to the conclusion that the world was not prepared for a pandemic like this, because we've seen ample examples of similar cases. We have the SARS, we have the bird flu, we have the MERS, we have the Ebola and things like that. All those are zoonotic virus disease, infectious diseases. So we have been warned. So one lesson we should learn from COVID-19 is that we should respect the science. And the top pictures is, this is James Hansen. He was a NASA top officials. He was making a statement or giving an explanation to the Congress of the US in 1989. That was 31 years ago. And this chart was his prediction of the temperature of the Earth back in the 1980s. Okay. The red one is the actual temperature, and then the blue one is the projection by his very rudimentary climate models, which is much more simpler than the climate models nowadays. But you will see that there is a striking similarity between the projected temperature and the actual temperature. So James Hansen and other scientists have been warning us for decades that global warming is occurring and it is bad, and we should do something urgently about it. But no one really listened to the science. So this is some lessons we should learn from COVID-19. Respect the science, because it is a matter of life and death. And factors that increases the zoonosis, I don't know how to pronounce it, zoonosis emergence, which is the wild animals carrying the virus and so on, is because of deforestation, is because of intensified agriculture and livestock. We have thousands of chickens flocking together, and cows basically do not have the space that they can turn around, and things like that. That it will increase the probability of virus transmission. We have illegal and poorly regulated wildlife trade, and then climate change is just to amplify the kind of viruses, the kind of crisis that we could be facing. All right, the second lesson that we should learn from the COVID-19 pandemic is that disasters respect no borders. On the left panels, we see some examples of extreme weather that we see in the past 12 months or so. This is in Australia, the wildfire triggered by months and months of drought and very high temperatures, and similar things occurring in California as we speak. And then this is heat wave in Europe. Probably you know that 17 years ago in 2003, one single heat wave killed 70,000 people in Europe. And we have just the exact opposite. Here we're talking about very high temperature and very little rainfall, but we have lots and lots of rainfall in Mozambique. This is because of 2 successive typhoons striking Mozambique, which is Mozambique is an area which is not common to have typhoons, but we have 2 successive typhoons in a single year. So this is out of the ordinary. And then we're flooding in Iran, all right? To our impression, for most of us who haven't been to Iran, this is a semi-arid area where rain should not be that heavy, but we do see a lot of heavy rainfall in Iran. So this just shows that the natural disasters, as we called it, is because of more and more extreme weather. And obviously, we are very familiar with this picture now. This is the confirmed cases of COVID-19 all over the world. We have some countries with less cases, we have some countries with more cases, but none of the countries, nearly 200 countries in the whole world, is spared from COVID-19. So there is no borders as far as natural disasters is concerned. Now that brings us to, this is an opportunity for us to reflect that in crisis like this, where there is no borders, we should seriously think about international cooperation. Instead of engaging one another in kind of Cold War mentality, like what Donald Trump has been doing for such a long time, it is time for us to show our collaboration, show our solidarity. Because without solidarity, without collaboration, there is no hope that we can conquer any of this crisis. COVID-19 is just one example. If one country is not doing well, like China in the first instance, and then a lot of other Western countries following on, then the whole world suffers. So collaboration, international collaboration is utmost important. Trade a little of your freedom for the greater good. I like this picture on the left very much because this little girl is wearing a mask, meaning that she is protecting herself and also to the people she loves. But at the same time, her T-shirt shows "I love Paris," because this carries the connotations of the Paris Agreement in just 5 years ago. Just 5 years ago, we have more than 190 countries all over the world coming to a consensus, coming to a common wish to fight against climate change. So this picture, this lovely picture of this lovely girl conveyed 2 messages which are very, very important to us. So trade a little of your freedom. Now, under the case of COVID-19, our freedom is called the freedom of wearing masks or not wearing masks. It's our freedom to keep social distancing. It's our freedom to not engaging in high-risk activities and so on. So this is our choice, right? There's no legislation at the present moment forbidding you to do something or the other. But we have a choice. So this is for COVID-19. But for climate change, it's more or less the same story. For example, this lady represents the lifestyle of the rich and famous. Here she is driving her Mercedes-Benz or whatever sport car to the airport and then alights aboard the private jet plane. And then she fly from New York maybe to London for a dinner, and then she fly back from London to dinner to New York after the dinner. So for this kind of rich and famous, they have a lot of freedom where they can trade off. And the trade-off is for the common good. And then during the last few months, we heard a lot about flattening the curve. This is represented by this graph here. This is for COVID-19, so number of cases of COVID-19. So we have 2 situations here. One situation is that we do very little to protect ourselves so that we have rapidly rising cases of COVID-19. The other graph, depicted in blue, is that we heed the advice of the experts. We wear masks, we do not engage ourselves in high-risk activity. And then the result is that we don't have so many cases of COVID-19, so much so that it is under the capacity of the healthcare system, meaning that the healthcare system of whatever country we're talking about is capable of dealing with the patients. The healthcare system is able to provide better healthcare to all those who are sick from COVID-19. And as a result, the mortality of people dying from COVID-19, despite the fact that the number of people affected may be the same, right, is less than the case where we do not have any protective measures. So this is an important message from the medical professions, particularly in the West. Now, for climate change, the situation is exactly the same. Here, this dotted line represents the capacity of the healthcare system, whereas this red line represents the capacity of Mother Nature. 1.5 degrees means a rise of temperature compared to the period of 1850 to 1900, which roughly represent the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. As a matter of fact, the Industrial Revolution started a little bit earlier, something like 1750. But the Industrial Revolution, which is connected or associated with high carbon dioxide emissions, probably started in the 1850s. And this is also particularly important because this is a period where we have instrumental observations, because the data are more reliable, because we have thermometers where we can measure the temperature very accurately, right? So this is the rise of the temperature from this reference period. So in 1960s, the temperature has risen by about 0.25 degrees Celsius. Right now, we are about 1 degree hotter than this period, than this reference period. Now, the scientist warns us that we should, by all means, control the rise of temperature to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is probably an equivalent of the healthcare system capacity, which is probably can be explained or visualized or understood as the capacity where the world can rejuvenate, can regenerate, because all our biosphere is actually a system where it can regenerate or recover from a certain damage. But if that capacity is exceeded, then the chances of the biosphere and Mother Nature recovering is becoming more slim, and it will put us in greater risk. So this is the advice of the scientists. So as we learned from the first lesson, that it's better for us to take heed from the advice of the scientists. So we should, but from now to this 1.5 degrees Celsius, there isn't much time. We're talking about maybe 20 years, all right, maybe 2040. By the time 2040, we might reach this sort of threshold if we continue sort of business as usual. And then the fifth lesson that we should learn is actually covered a little bit in the earlier slides, is that we should take swift actions in case of crisis. As a matter of fact, when Bill Gates delivered his talk about the pandemic 5 years ago, he emphasized that we should have a wartime mentality, which means that when we deal with crisis of these dimensions, we should be having a mindset like dealing with a war. So in a war, when we're facing a war or engaging in a war, everything has to be done very quickly and with a very vigorous manner. So, but some of them, for example, like Donald Trump, would use the excuse that, okay, when we want to protect ourselves against climate change, well, in the first place, he doesn't believe in the science of climate change. But even if he believes in the science of climate change, it will use the excuse that it's too expensive to do anything against climate change. Okay. So economic consideration is one aspect that all of us are concerned about. But here is a very new study by a group of Stanford scholars, published just 2 years ago, that this RCP things is actually what we call the scenarios. Suffices for you to know that for RCP 8.5, it means the most pessimistic scenario where we take very little climate action. For RCP 2.6, it simply means that we take a lot of, well, all the actions necessary, right, within the technology we know today. So, for example, this one, which is RCP 8.5, then the GDP loss for the whole world can reach 10% up to 2049. So 30 years from now, we could lose a GDP of 10%. You can compare that with COVID-19, all right? For example, in Hong Kong, I don't know, it seems that the GDP loss for Hong Kong up to now is something like 7 or 8% or thereabout. So that is the near-term situation. But for the long-term situation, up to the end of the century, if we take the RCP 8.5 approach, then the loss of GDP could be somewhere near 35%. So that is a sort of economic loss no one can withstand. No country can withstand. But on the contrary, the same group of scientists in Harvard and Stanford, I think this is Harvard study, said that it would take active actions to fight against climate change. It would only cost us 0.1% of the GDP. So if you believe in the advice of the scientist, then the obvious choice is to take aggressive actions right now, right? This is only just from the economic point of view. But of course, when they do that economic study, they sort of take into consideration of other aspects called the externality. For example, how burning of coal will make the air quality deteriorate so that we have to spend more money in terms of our healthcare system. So all this are taken into consideration. So if everything is taken into consideration, then the money or the cost of climate action is really, really very low. And then from the case of COVID-19, this is not the most updated data just up to the second quarter of this year. This is about the economic decline of all countries or most countries over the world. For example, in United Kingdom, in the USA, you see something like 20% or 10% drop in the GDP, right? Noticeably, those are countries that do not impose very drastic action in terms of fighting against COVID-19. But on the contrary, for Taiwan, for countries in our region, Japan, Korea, and for that matter, China, Singapore, and so on, where they take very drastic measures to spread, to suppress the spread of the disease, then they are seeing only a mild decline in the GDP. And as a matter of fact, for China, while they suffered about 7% decrease in GDP in the first quarter, there is a rise in 3% in GDP in China. So even economically speaking, it justified drastic action, aggressive actions in the case of crisis. But it's sad to hear that there are a lot of opinions that are opposed to the idea of strong drastic actions, including, for example, a Supreme Court judge in the UK. And his opinion is, of course, that this kind of lockdown or measures are similar to draconian measures. This is something that I don't understand. As a judge, you do not have the insight of the medical professions, and therefore you are not in a position to say anything regarding protection of the public against this pandemic. So we have a lot of KOLs nowadays. What I'm trying to say is that if you're a KOL, you better be careful of what you're speaking, right? Because you have a lot of influence to the people who are listening to you. Okay, so this is perhaps the last lessons that I can think of in terms of COVID-19 in connection with climate change. It is that the vulnerable people in the world are those people who are hurt the most. So the left panel is about COVID-19. So I'm not going to each column, just suffice to say that this is for the white people in the US. And then compare with the white people in the US, for example, the Black community, the people who are the Black African, the cases of COVID-19 is 2.6 times higher. And then the mortality or the death is 2 times higher. The hospitalization rate is nearly 5 times higher than the white people. And obviously in the US, the Black, the African American are those people who are less privileged. They belong mostly to the vulnerable classes and so on. So this is the case for the US. And as far as the whole world is concerned, this is for the whole world. We can see that for high income and middle, upper high income, then the shares of the country according to change in severity is that they are less than 50%. Whereas for those countries which are developing or low income or lower middle incomes, the change in severity is more than 50%. So what it means by this graph is that they will become more vulnerable as time progresses if we do not have any effective measures of really controlling COVID-19. Now, over on the right-hand side, this is even more true for the case of climate change or people suffering from the consequences of climate change. This is Kiribati, which is a small country in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, consisting of 28 coral reef islands, so very small islands. I've been there about 9 years ago doing a documentary, and the people are living in a very, bad environment. They are close to the seashore. And you can imagine a situation where the sea level is continually rising, and they're being threatened day and night by flooding of the sea of where they live. And what is worse is that those are very small islands with no mountains at all. Those people have nowhere to go. Now, if we talk about the reason for climate change, they are the least responsible for the phenomenon of climate change because the carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gas that they emit is the least among all the world. So this brings to the problem of what we call the climate justice. The people who are least responsible for the climate crisis will be most vulnerable in the face of severe weather associated with climate change. I'm going to skip that one for the sake of time. And then what we are afraid of, the kind of crisis that we're going to face in the future, or even now, is the chances of multiple exposure. For one single crisis, probably we can go through that crisis, but with multiple exposures, in particular because we're going to have more extreme weather in the future. Like in China, we have flooding in Chang'an earlier this year, and we have typhoons in Philippines and lots of hurricanes in the US this year. Then people will have to deal with multiple threats and multiple exposure. And these are the situations where people becomes most vulnerable. So my last slide is, as pointed out by Professor Mock, that I've been doing this mole observatory for 2 years now. And I also take the responsibility to write the script for this program. Now, it occurs to me that under the crisis of COVID-19 or climate change, all of us are script writers. All right, how the story evolve into the futures are to a large extent up to us. You can write a script which promises a future of hope and happiness, but at the same time, you can also write another script which is that the whole human race will be facing suffering and despair. So it's entirely up to us. So you and I are script writers. We together, 7.4 billion of us together, hopefully will write a script that promises hope and happiness. And as a last conclusion to this sharing, the Council for Sustainable Development has just lately, very recently, come up with a report about the long-term decarbonization strategy in Hong Kong. This is one of the work I was involved, as pointed out by Professor Mok. This is a bottom-up approach. A lot of public engagement meetings has been held. A lot of public opinions was received through questionnaires and response and so on. So based on the public view, the council come up with a recommendation for the government. And the Hong Kong government is going to come up with a blueprint or the roadmap for the future. How are we going to decarbonize Hong Kong in the next 30 or 40 years? So I hope all of you will take some time to go to this website and see how, as a script writer, right, how can we contribute to writing a story of hope and happiness for the greater good of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Leung, for the interesting sharing. Please stay for the next session. The next coming up is a Q&A session. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to invite Ms. Florence Chan, the Executive Officer of SAO, to act as a facilitator. Ms. Florence Chan, please.
Thank you, Chloe. Welcome to the Q&A section. This section will be around 20 minutes. If you have any questions for Mr. Leung, please indicate by pressing the button to raise your hand or send your questions to us via the chat box. Maybe Mr. Leung, let me ask the first question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so as you have mentioned, Save the Earth have to depend on each of us. Would you please suggest a few and effective, simple ways in our daily practice that we can help?
Well, lots of things we can do, actually.
Mm-hmm.
The problem about this climate crisis is, unfortunately, we do not have a silver bullet, so to speak. We do not have a single effective methods which can solve all the problems about climate change. So we have to apply all necessary technologies, change in lifestyle and things like that. The collective effect of all those actions would hopefully lead us to a sort of decarbonization situation few decades from now. One basic principle of we as an individual is to apply the principle of being thrifty. Thrifty means thrifty means that we spend only when it is necessary. We buy only the things that is only necessary for our survival, for our health and whatever. And we don't, because in this day and age where internet shopping is so popular, that we have to think twice when we buy something over the internet. Because take for instance, the shirt that I'm wearing, this is, I don't know, a wool wool t-shirt. Manufacturing this shirt give rise to roughly about 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So that's quite a lot, because 100 kilograms, a fat man like me weighs less than 100 kilograms. So it's a lot of carbon dioxide. So when you buy something, make sure that it's something that you really need. Because one thing that you buy less, then you are saving a lot of carbon dioxide emission. So as a general principle, this is something that we should do. There are other things, of course, for example, I just watched a documentary late last night. It's about the climate change. It's about a lot of people in many parts of the world, including California, including what they call the Sahel region in Africa, which is the region just immediately south of the Sahara Desert. People have to move away from their own countries because of the continuing worsening drought situation there. Because most of them are farmers. Most of them grow their own food and raise their own animals and so on. But because of the drying conditions, they have to leave their home for other countries. So this is actually what we call climate migrants. Because they have to move away because of climate reasons. So that includes California, that includes parts of the US, Texas for that matter. That includes the Middle East. We heard about the Syrian crisis where millions of people move away from Syria. And all those are related to drying condition or drought condition that they experience. Now, for those people, they have very little or no water at their disposal. But for us as a Hong Kong person or average Hong Kong people, we consume about 130 liters of water every day. That is, I mean, very wasteful by all standards. Not the standard for those places which are suffering from drought, but from a global average point of view. But while we spend that much water, do bear in mind that every drop of water is associated with carbon dioxide emission. Every extra drop of water that we wasted will contribute to the worsening of the climate crisis, because every drop of water involves quite a lot of energy in transporting it from all the way from Dongjiang to Hong Kong, transporting it from Dongjiang to the reservoirs, and then treating it, and then transporting the water from the reservoirs all the way to the apartments where we live. So it involves a lot of energy. Therefore, I always appeal to many of us that we have to have a sort of risk management mentality, because probably all of us participating in this sharing sections are much younger than I do. I have the unfortunate experience of going through the very bad drought in 1963 in Hong Kong. I can promise you, a drought is a very, very painful experience. And worst of all, is a situation or one experience that would drive you crazy. We have a lot of people suffering from depression nowadays in Hong Kong. If we're going to have a drought, I'm sure that a lot of people will be suffering from a lot more mental cases, because it is a situation which will drive you hopeless. Because I still remember, I was 11 at that time, but I still remember that all people in Hong Kong at that time were hoping for rain. You know, we have the Buddhist people praying for rain. We have the Catholic people, the Christian people, all praying for rain, day after day, and the rain didn't come. And it will drive you into despair, into increasing despair. And that will drive you into some kind of mental depression and so on. So, I mean, there are a lot of sufferings in a lot of people all over the world, but the worst suffering is that from despair and hopelessness. And drought is one of those. So I always try to impress upon people that be thrifty with your spending and also be thrifty with the use of water, because water is a very, very precious resource. So of course, this is, I mean, on a personal basis, on individual basis, there are lots of things we can do, but the general principle is that we should not be wasteful. But of course, we can make use of technology to sort of to help us, or to help the global community to fight the climate crisis. For example, if we're living on the countryside or the new territory with a low rising house, low rise house, then you can probably install solar panels and have generating renewable energy for the whole of Hong Kong and things like that. And one thing which is very important is to engage into constructive discussion with the peers, with your friends, with your families, and so on, so that it's not just you carrying out individual activities or behavior, but try to change people around you.
Thank you for your elaboration. I see Cindy from FHS has raised hand. She would like to ask you a question.
Yes, please.
Hello, Cindy.
Can you write it in the chat room?
Yeah, maybe we can ask you to check room first. She has raised hand. Maybe my technician can ask you to write. Okay. The first question from the chat box is, in the past 100 years, technology has been developing so fast at the cost of environmental damage. Would you see COVID-19 pandemic as a punishment to human beings who pollute the earth and lead to climate change crisis?
I wouldn't consider that as a punishment, but this is, again, a lesson that we can learn from the advance of the technology. Right now, our civilization is a civilization of technology. Technology advancing day after day, but very often when we developed any new technology, we do not have in mind a comprehensive assessment of the impact of a new technology to the environment. We are more focused on a very narrow objective of, I don't know, for example, for the medical profession is of course for the health of the patients, and for the IT, maybe increasing the speed of the computer and things like that. But we haven't considered the wider impacts of a new technology that could possibly bring damage to the environment. For example, in the case of climate change or mitigating climate change, there are lots of proposals called geoengineering, which change the world, the physics of the world, the operation of the world in such a way that we can reduce the rise of the temperature or decrease the rise of carbon dioxide. But that kind of technology, which is not actually operational right now, carries a lot of unknown possibility, which can bring quite a lot of undesirable consequences. So we have to think through all those before we actually put a new technology into practice. That is perhaps the answer I can give.
I see. So we have another question from Tiffany.
Yes, please.
Yes. Hello.
Oh, hello, can you hear?
Hello, Tiffany.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, please state your question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Mr. Lang. So I have a question here. So what do you think of China as a government is doing in terms of global warming? So I know that the Chinese government has joined the Paris Agreement in 2015. And also just in September, the president announced that China try to achieve the carbon neutrality by 2060. So may I know what is your opinion on this? Thank you.
Tiffany, thank you for the answer. Unfortunately, my personal interest is more on the science of climate change rather than the policy-wise. But in any case, this is good news. If you compare President Xi with President Donald Trump, then obviously President Xi is giving us a roadmap. We don't know the details as to how China is going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. But at least we have an aspiration. At least we have a vision. And I mean, the whole of China should work together to make this vision a reality. There have been quite a lot of discussion as to how China is going to achieve this, but nothing official, as far as I come across, has been heard. But this is going to be challenging, but not impossible task. Given the situation in China, we have a lot of resources, and in terms of renewable energy, we have quite a lot of wind energy in the northern part of China, and quite a lot of solar energy in China. And with the rapid development of other technology, maybe, for example, which is probably very controversial, is the application of nuclear energy. I mean, as a common layman, we all have some reservation about the application of nuclear energy. But as far as the professionals, the engineers are concerned, and also the scientists, for example, I mentioned James Hansen, the first whistleblower, so to speak, in the US. He is a strong supporter of nuclear energy. And also I mentioned Bill Gates. He's also a strong supporter of nuclear energy. As a matter of fact, Bill Gates has developed, used his own money to develop a new kind of nuclear technology that should be tried, that should be tested out and tried out in China. But unfortunately, because of the Cold War mentality of Donald Trump, that plan has to be scrapped. I mean, that new technology cannot be tried in China. That is a setback, because as I said, climate change, to combat against climate change, we do not have a silver bullet. We do not have one single method that can solve the problem. We have to apply all technologies possible. So nuclear energy is one which is widely supported by the technical or technological community. But a lot of people, particularly in Hong Kong, a lot of apprehension about this technology. But all I have to say is to keep an open mind. So to answer your question very briefly, it is very good that China as a whole, the most populous country in the whole world, the largest carbon dioxide emitter in the whole world, has come up with a vision. And I am hopeful that, judging from how China deal with COVID-19, not disregarding the first couple of months where Wuhan is probably very problematic at the very first instance. Judging with how it deals, starting with the lockdown of Wuhan and so on, regarding COVID-19, I am hopeful that China can promise what we call the national contribution of carbon dioxide emission. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Mr. Leung, I have received another question from the chat box. So the question is, disposal of face masks has added to an unprecedented pollution problem. Is there any approach we could take to reduce the pollution problem while protecting ourselves from the pandemic?
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, not my expertise. Again, I'm a strong believer that all this kind of problem has to be solved scientifically, technologically. Mm-hmm. climate change is just one example. I mean, it's good to ask everyone to change their personal behavior, but we all know that it's very, very difficult. We have a lot of resilience among friends, so to speak. So it's good for every one of us to change our lifestyle to a more climate-friendly lifestyle. But the ultimate solution, I think, lies in technology. And face mask is probably one of those areas where if we could depend, if we can develop better material, probably polyU should be the front line of that kind of technology, because we have the clothing department and things like that. We can develop materials that can be biodegradable, not hurting the environment and things like that. And in that case, that will partly help to solve the problem. Yeah, I think that's all I know about that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Leung. This is the end to the Q&A section. It's about over 20 minutes. We are very happy to have you with us, and we have learned a lot from you today.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, students and colleagues, for your participation. Oh, still have another question. Okay. There's another question.
Yeah, I see part of the questions. As a scientist, I'm a retired scientist. I have not been engaging in the active research, scientific research for a long time, actually. So I think our role as an individual is to do our utmost according to our capacity, according to our ability. So for me, I don't think I can contribute to the advancement of technology or science, but I can probably provide inspiration for people, in particular younger people, to become more aware of the crisis that we are facing, to take active actions collaboratively, so that we can come up with a scenario where every one of us will have a brighter future and a happy future. So that is exactly what I'm doing right now. For example, I'm giving talk right now. I hope that if at all, will give some inspiration for the younger students to actively engage yourself in learning more about climate change, in taking part in climate actions. Well, we have lots and lots of information available through the internet about what kind of climate actions we can take. So I think each one has a role to play. And as a retired scientist, then my role is probably to inspire more young people to be more aware of the situation, because very unfortunately in Hong Kong, the situation is that a lot of people knows about climate change, but very few of them thinks that climate change is an imminent problem, is an imminent threat. We are always being misled by the popular saying that Hong Kong is a blessed land. 香港係福地. This is very misleading. We are not immune from natural disasters like stronger typhoons in the future, like more flooding, like even drought. One thing that I'm quite worried about what climate change will bring to Hong Kong is a severe drought in the future, because the population of Hong Kong has grown significantly. The population in southern China has also grown exponentially, but we share the only water resources from Dongjiang, from Pearl River. That is all the water resources we have, right? So another drought is probably beyond our capability to sort of fight off. So I think every one of us has a role to play, and as a retired scientist, I think all I can do is to inspire more people to work together. Thank you.
I see. So if there is no more questions, we can end the sections here. Thank you once again,
Okay, thank
Mr.
you.
Leung, and thank you, students and colleagues, for your participation in this Q&A section. I wish you all the best and stay healthy.
Thank you, Mr. Leung and Ms. Chan. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this talk informative and fascinating. To express a sincere appreciation to Mr. Wing-Mo Leung, we would like to invite Professor Esmond Mok to present a souvenir to Mr. Leung. Professor Mok, please.
Chris, sorry.
Today, we look forward to welcoming you again at our upcoming talks. Lastly, please be reminded to scan this QR code and complete the online evaluation form. Goodbye.